We didn't lose Atlantis to the sea. We lost it to silence. 7 times humanity held proof in its hands, physical evidence, documented discoveries, artifacts that shouldn't exist. And 7 times that proof vanished. Not eroded by time, not buried by nature, but removed. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence, too deliberate to be accident. This isn't about a lost city. This is about lost evidence, and the question nobody wants to answer: who keeps making it disappear? The first time wasn't even ancient. It was 1947. Off the northern coast of Germany sits Heligoland, a small island most people have never heard of. Rocky cliffs, strategic harbor, nothing particularly remarkable to the modern eye. Yet in the years before World War II, a German pastor named Jürgen Spanuth became obsessed with it. Not for religious reasons, for archaeological ones. Because when he compared Plato's description of Atlantis to the geography of Heligoland, the similarities weren't just close. They were identical. Plato described Atlantis as a coastal plain protected by mountains to the north. Heligoland matched. He specified that the city controlled trade routes between multiple seas. Heligoland sat exactly where the North Sea and Baltic Sea converge, the Bronze Age's most valuable shipping corridor. Even the measurements aligned. Plato's dimensions for Atlantis's central island, nearly exact to Heligoland's pre-erosion size based on geological surveys. Spanuth found more than geographical coincidence. Bronze Age ruins dotted the island, remnants of advanced metallurgy, evidence of a catastrophic flooding event around 1200 BCE, precisely when Plato said Atlantis fell. Local legends spoke of a great city swallowed by the sea, kings who ruled the northern waters, a civilization destroyed in a single night of storms. Furthermore, the name itself carried weight. Heligoland derived from Holy Land, a place ancient tribes treated as sacred, as touched by gods who no longer walk the earth. Then came 1947. The British Royal Navy needed to dispose of surplus ordnance after the war. Thousands of tons of bombs, shells and explosives that couldn't be transported safely. So they chose Heligoland. On April 18th, they detonated 6,700 tons of explosives in what remains the largest non-nuclear explosion in history. The blast was visible from the mainland. The shockwave registered on seismographs across Europe, and when the smoke cleared, Heligoland's archaeological record had been obliterated. Libraries holding Spanuth's research, destroyed. Excavation sites buried under rubble. The island's museum collection vaporized. Even the shape of the island changed, cliffs collapsed, harbor walls erased, anything that might have supported the Atlantis connection reduced to fragments. Was it really just convenient timing? Britain had dozens of remote locations for ordnance disposal. Why choose the one island a respected researcher had just linked to humanity's most famous lost civilization? Why demolish the evidence the same decade it was being documented? Spanuth spent the rest of his life trying to recreate his findings from memory. Nobody would fund excavations. Nobody would publish his later work. And Heligoland? It became a tourist destination, its past buried beneath resort hotels and carefully curated silence. The first proof vanished in fire and thunder. 6 more times the pattern would repeat. They found it on an island no ancient civilization should have reached. The year was 1749. Portuguese explorers were mapping the Azores, that chain of volcanic islands rising from the mid-Atlantic ridge like stepping stones between continents. On Corvo, the smallest and most remote island, they discovered something that didn't belong. A statue. Not crude, not primitive, masterfully carved from stone, depicting a figure on horseback, one arm raised, pointing definitively west towards nothing but open ocean, toward the edge of the known world. The craftsmanship alone demanded attention. This wasn't European. It wasn't Christian. The style predated Portuguese arrival by centuries, perhaps millennia. The horse's musculature showed anatomical knowledge that shouldn't exist in a culture isolated from mainland civilization. The rider's posture suggested nobility, authority, someone memorializing an important direction or destination. Yet what confused the explorers most was the inscription carved into the base. But nobody could read it. Not Portuguese scholars, not Greek experts, not anyone familiar with Latin, Arabic, Phoenician, or any known Mediterranean script. The characters existed in no reference text, matched no archaeological record, and resembled nothing in Europe's vast linguistic archives. It was as if the statue spoke a language that predated language itself. Consequently, it became the most compelling mystery of its age. The Portuguese authorities made the obvious decision: send it to Lisbon. Let the finest minds in the capital examine it. Let historians, linguists, and theologians debate its origin. The statue arrived at the Royal Museum, was catalogued, placed under study, and suddenly became the subject of fevered academic speculation. What ancient civilization reached the Azores? What did the inscription say? And most troubling of all, what lay west of Corvo that warranted such a permanent marker? Then came November 1st, 1755. The Lisbon earthquake struck at 9:40 in the morning, magnitude 8.5, followed by a tsunami that swallowed the harbor and a firestorm that consumed what the water missed. The Royal Museum collapsed. Its entire collection, centuries of artifacts, documents, records, turned to ash and rubble in a matter of hours. When survivors finally sifted through the ruins, the Corvo statue had vanished completely. No fragments recovered. No sketches made during its 6 years in Lisbon, no rubbings of the mysterious inscription. Only written descriptions survived, preserved in letters and journals of scholars who'd seen it briefly before disaster struck. They remembered the pointing arm, they remembered the unreadable text, they remembered how unsettling it felt, this ancient marker standing on an island that Plato himself had described as part of Atlantis' island chain. Because here's what nobody mentions. The Azores sit exactly where Plato placed Atlantis, in the Atlantic beyond the Pillars of Hercules, atop a sunken landmass that geological surveys now confirm once existed above sea level. The mid-Atlantic ridge experienced catastrophic subsidence around 9,600 BCE, the same date Plato gave for Atlantis' destruction. What are the odds that the one artifact physically pointing toward that sunken civilization burns in Europe's most devastating natural disaster? The statue knew something, the statue showed something, and before anyone could fully document what it revealed, fire claimed it just like it claimed Heligoland's archives. Different century, different method. Same result, so if you're starting to notice the pattern, hit that like button and subscribe, because the disappearances are just beginning and the next one involves the man who started it all. Plato was writing the ending, then he stopped. Every discussion of Atlantis begins with Plato's dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE. These aren't vague myths or poetic allegories. They're detailed accounts with measurements, metallurgy, agricultural systems, architectural specifications. Plato describes Atlantis with the precision of someone reading from historical records, not inventing fantasy. Yet Critias, the dialogue dedicated entirely to Atlantis, does something inexplicable. It stops mid-sentence. Not at a natural conclusion, not after describing the city's fall, right in the middle of Zeus calling a council of gods to judge Atlantis for its corruption. The text literally ends with, "And when he had assembled them, he spoke thus." Nothing. No conclusion, no battle, no divine punishment, no description of how or why the greatest civilization in human history vanished beneath the waves in a single day and night. The most important part of the story just missing. However, ancient sources suggest the ending once existed. Cranta, a Greek philosopher writing just 60 years after Plato's death, references details about Atlantis' destruction that don't appear in surviving texts. Proclus, a 5th century scholar, quotes passages describing the final war between Athens and Atlantis that no modern copy contains. Plutarch mentions sections explaining how the gods physically sank the island. These weren't invented additions. They were referencing a complete version of Critias that later generations somehow lost. So what happened to it? The Library of Alexandria is the obvious suspect, the ancient world's greatest repository of knowledge, holding copies of every significant text from every civilization. When it burned, whether by Caesar's troops in 48 BCE, Christian mobs in 391 CE, or Arab conquest in 641 CE, historians still debate. Thousands of irreplaceable manuscripts turned to ash, among them likely the complete Critias, the ending that explained everything, the details that would prove whether Plato was recording history or inventing allegory. Yet there's another possibility that's far more disturbing. Medieval monasteries controlled which ancient texts survived. Monks decided what got copied, what got preserved, what got translated, and they had clear motivations for making certain edits. The early church was constructing a timeline where human civilization began around 4000 BCE with Adam and Eve. Any text suggesting advanced civilizations existed 9,600 years before Plato, 11,600 years ago, directly contradicted Genesis. It made Noah's flood look like a recent regional event, rather than the first and only global catastrophe. Plato's Atlantis was too detailed to dismiss as fiction, too measured to ignore as poetry. Therefore, the safest solution was incompleteness. Let the story exist, but remove the ending. Remove the parts that described how an advanced Bronze Age civilization could exist thousands of years before the Bible said creation began. Remove the proof that humanity had already risen to greatness and fallen long before divine covenants were made. Because here's what makes the missing ending so dangerous. Everything Plato describes about Atlantis, the concentric rings, the Orichalcum Metal, the canal systems, he presents as verifiable fact. He names his sources, he provides measurements. He insists this isn't mythology, but history recovered from Egyptian records. If the ending existed and described geological catastrophe rather than divine punishment, it would mean paradise was built without God's permission and destroyed by nature's indifference. We have the blueprint, we have the location, we have everything except the moment of truth. And that absence feels less like loss and more like surgery. Plato didn't invent Atlantis, he translated it. This is what Sunday school never mentions. Plato wasn't the original source, he was the messenger. In Timaeus, he's explicit about where the story came from. His ancestor Solon, the legendary Athenian lawmaker, traveled to Egypt around 590 BCE, seeking wisdom from cultures older than Greece. At Sais, in the Nile Delta, Egyptian priests took him into the temple of Neith and told him something that shattered his understanding of history. "You Greeks are children," they said. "You know nothing of true antiquity." The priests described civilizations that rose and fell long before Greece existed. Wars fought when Athens was just scattered villages. A great island empire that controlled the Atlantic and threatened the Mediterranean 9,000 years before Solon's visit. They didn't recite this from memory. They read it from pillars. Stone columns inscribed with historical records stretching back tens of thousands of years, maintained and updated by generations of scribes, preserved in the temple specifically for moments like this. Plato states clearly, Solon saw these pillars, he took notes, he intended to write his own account, but died before completing it. The story passed to his descendants until it reached Plato, who finally immortalized it in dialogue form. This wasn't Greek mythology, it was Egyptian history, documented on stone, verified by priests whose entire purpose was preserving truth against the erosion of time. Crantor, that same philosopher who verified Plato's complete text, didn't just read scrolls. He traveled to Egypt himself around 300 BCE to confirm the source. And he reported back, the pillars existed. He saw them. They bore hieroglyphic inscriptions describing Atlantis in detail, its rise, its power, its conflict with Proto-Athens, its destruction. The physical evidence Plato's critics demanded was standing in the Temple of Neith, exactly where the dialogue said it would be. Then Rome conquered Egypt. The Temple of Neith at Sahara, one of Egypt's oldest and most sacred sites, fell into decline under Roman rule. Temples that served Egyptian gods became inconvenient to occupiers, converting the province to Roman religion. By the early centuries of the Common Era, classical historians mention Sais in the past tense. The temple complex destroyed. The pillars gone, scattered, used as building materials for Roman construction projects, or deliberately defaced by early Christian zealots who saw Egyptian wisdom as pagan corruption. Arab historians writing centuries later reference texts from before the flood housed in Egyptian temples. They describe pillars covered in ancient script that predated pharaonic dynasties. Yet by medieval times, even these references became vague, mythological, treated as legends rather than archaeological reality. Modern Sais is barely excavated. The few archaeological surveys conducted found fragments, column bases, scattered hieroglyphs, evidence of deliberate systematic destruction. Notice the pattern. Every civilization that documented Atlantis lost its records to fire, flood, conquest, or institutional erasure. The Greeks lost the complete Critias. The Egyptians lost the temple pillars. And we're expected to believe this is coincidence, that the two independent sources, one Greek, one Egyptian, both citing physical evidence, just happened to vanish within centuries of each other. The pillars existed. Kranta confirmed it, yet no museum holds fragments, no library preserves transcriptions, no archaeological expedition receives funding to dig deeper at Sai. Because if those pillars were real, if they described Atlantis as documented history rather than Platonic allegory, then everything about ancient chronology collapses. They didn't lose the evidence, they disposed of it. In 2015, they finally found Atlantis's legendary metal. Then it disappeared again. Plato wasn't vague about Orichalcum. He described it with the specificity of someone who'd seen inventory lists. A metal that glowed like fire, second in value only to gold, covering the walls of Atlantis' inner temple and the columns of Poseidon's shrine. He mentioned it 5 times across both dialogues, always as something real, traded, and precious. For 2,000 years, scholars assumed it was mythological embellishment, gold-copper alloy at best, poetic license at worst. Then a shipwreck off Sicily changed everything. Divers exploring a 2,600-year-old merchant vessel near Gela discovered 39 ingots of an unknown metal in the cargo hold. Not bronze, not brass, not any alloy documented in archaeological records. The ingots had a distinctive reddish gold sheen that matched ancient descriptions of Orichalcum perfectly. Chemical analysis revealed something even stranger. A precise mixture of copper, zinc, and trace elements that didn't correspond to any known ancient metallurgical technique. The dating was almost too perfect. The ship sank during the 6th century BCE, right when Plato said Atlantean trade networks would have still been operating through Mediterranean intermediaries. The location? Directly along the routes Plato described for Atlantean commerce. Sicily sat between Atlantis and the eastern Mediterranean, exactly where you'd expect merchant vessels carrying exotic metals from the west. Furthermore, the metallurgical analysis revealed something modern smelting couldn't easily replicate. The ratio of elements suggested an advanced understanding of metal properties, creating an alloy that resisted corrosion better than bronze, held an edge better than copper, yet remained workable at lower temperatures. This wasn't primitive experimentation. This was sophisticated material science. The discovery made international headlines for approximately 48 hours. Major publications ran stories. Atlantis researchers called it vindication. Metallurgists expressed genuine curiosity about the alloy's unique properties. Museums expressed interest in acquiring samples for further study. Then, as quickly as the excitement emerged, it vanished. Follow-up studies? Never published. Detailed chemical breakdowns? Never released. Plans for additional excavation of the shipwreck? Quietly abandoned. The ingots went to a regional museum in Sicily, displayed briefly, then removed from public exhibition. Requests from independent researchers to examine them were denied. Funding for additional Mediterranean shipwreck surveys that might find similar cargo mysteriously dried up. The story disappeared from academic journals as if someone had decided the conversation was over before it really began. Here's what makes this suppression so revealing. If the ingots were just unusual bronze, why not study them thoroughly and prove it? If Orichalcum was merely ancient brass, why not publish comprehensive analysis and close the Atlantis question permanently? The silence suggests something more threatening than myth confirmation. It suggests the metallurgical evidence is real, datable, and traceable to a source that shouldn't exist, according to accepted chronology. Because if Atlantean trade goods are sitting in a Sicilian shipwreck, then Atlantis wasn't allegory. It was economy, it was industry. It was a civilization advanced enough to develop proprietary alloys and export them across the Mediterranean. And that means every assumption about Bronze Age technological development needs revision. The metal existed. We held it. We tested it. Then we looked away. Why does physical evidence require so much effort to ignore? Edgar Cayce predicted it in 1938. Then they found it in 1968. Cayce, America's most famous psychic, made thousands of predictions during his lifetime. Most were vague. Some were wrong. Yet one was disturbingly specific. In a trance reading, he declared that portions of Atlantis would rise again near Bimini in the Bahamas during 1968 or 1969. He described underwater structures that would surface as proof of the lost civilization. His followers waited. Skeptics laughed. Archaeologists ignored him entirely. Then in September 1968, a pilot named Robert Brush was flying over shallow waters near North Bimini when he spotted something impossible. Beneath the crystal-clear Caribbean water lay a formation of massive limestone blocks stretching nearly half a mile in a perfectly straight line before turning at a precise right angle. Not scattered rocks, not random coral. Deliberate rectangular stones, some weighing several tons, arranged in a pattern that looked exactly like an ancient harbor wall or coastal road. The alignment was too perfect, the angles too sharp, the engineering too obvious. Divers descended immediately. What they found didn't match any natural geological formation documented in the Caribbean. The blocks showed flat surfaces and uniform edges. Tool marks appeared on several stones. Some blocks featured what looked like anchor holes used in ancient maritime construction. Most troubling of all, the formation created a distinct J-shaped harbor, exactly the kind Bronze Age civilizations built to protect ships from ocean currents. The academic response was immediate dismissal. Beach rock, they declared, natural limestone that fractured into rectangular shapes through wave action and erosion. Nothing artificial, nothing ancient. Just geology coincidentally mimicking human construction. Yet here's what they couldn't explain. Beach rock doesn't form in straight lines for half a mile. It doesn't turn at right angles, it doesn't create harbor shapes, and it definitely doesn't show up exactly where and when someone predicted it 30 years earlier. Researchers who wanted to investigate further hit bureaucratic walls. Funding requests denied, permits delayed indefinitely. The site became controversial, which in archaeology means don't touch it if you value your career. Meanwhile, divers continued finding more structures nearby. Additional walls, platform formations, what appeared to be deliberate stone arrangements aligned with astronomical positions. Carbon dating of material trapped beneath the stones suggested construction around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. The exact time frame Plato gave for Atlantis, the exact period when sea levels were rising globally, swallowing coastal civilizations. The exact moment when someone might build a harbor in what's now shallow water, but was then dry coastal plain. Recent expeditions using ground-penetrating sonar revealed even more structures buried under sand nearby. Grid patterns suggesting city planning. Stone formations arranged in ways that natural processes simply don't produce. Each discovery makes the Just Rocks explanation more desperate, more forced, more obviously incomplete. Why does just beach rock require so much institutional effort to dismiss? Why does a natural formation need gatekeepers preventing independent study? Why do career archaeologists warn students away from investigating it? Because Bimini Road does exactly what evidence isn't supposed to do. It sits in Plato's described location. It dates to Plato's described time frame. It matches Plato's described construction techniques. If you're starting to see the pattern that every time physical evidence appears, institutional forces ensure it disappears from serious discussion, then you're beginning to understand what's been hidden in plain sight. You can see it from space, you still can't study it. Deep in the Mauritanian desert lies the Richat structure, a geological formation so massive and so perfectly circular that astronauts use it as a landmark from orbit. 25 miles in diameter, concentric rings of raised rock alternating with valleys. A bullseye carved into the Sahara so precise it looks artificial even from 200 miles up. Then someone compared it to Plato's description of Atlantis. The match isn't close, it's exact. Plato described Atlantis as concentric circles of land and water, alternating rings protecting a central island. The Richat structure shows the same pattern, rings of different rock types creating natural channels where water once flowed. Plato gave specific measurements for Atlantis's diameter. The Richat structure matches those dimensions when you account for the unit conversion from ancient Greek stadia. He said mountains sheltered the city to the north. The Richat sits against a mountain range on its northern edge. Furthermore, Plato mentioned Atlantis was originally inland before catastrophic flooding connected it to the sea. The Richat structure sits in the Sahara, which geological evidence proves was fertile and water-rich until around 10,000 BCE. Ancient river channels, still visible from satellite imagery, lead directly from the structure toward what was once the Atlantic coast. The timeline aligns, the geography aligns. Even the orientation aligns with Plato's description of the structure opening southward toward the sea. Mainstream geology insists it's natural, either an eroded dome or the result of ancient volcanic activity. Yet neither explanation satisfies the evidence. Erosion doesn't create perfect circles. It creates irregular patterns following rock weaknesses. Volcanic domes don't produce such precise concentric symmetry, and neither process explains the rectangular grid patterns satellite analysis reveals within the structure. Patterns that look disturbingly like city planning. Local Berber legends speak of a great city swallowed by sand. Ancient texts reference a civilization in northwest Africa that predated Egypt and vanished in catastrophe. Greek historians placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the direction of the setting sun. From the Mediterranean, that direction points directly toward Mauritania. Expeditions seeking permission to conduct ground surveys face rejection. Too remote, authorities claim, despite researchers offering to fund the work entirely. The site remains accessible to tourists, but forbidden to serious archaeological investigation. Why does a natural formation require such careful gatekeeping? Because the Richat structure represents the most dangerous kind of evidence, the kind you can't destroy. You can't demolish it like Heligoland. You can't burn it like the Corvo Statue. You can't hide it in museum storage like Orichalcum ingots. It sits in plain sight, visible from space, matching Plato's description in every measurable detail. So instead, you declare it off limits. You deny funding. You make investigation so professionally dangerous that no credible archaeologist dares pursue it. 7 times we found proof. 7 times it vanished, through explosion, fire, earthquake, institutional suppression, and bureaucratic obstruction. Different methods, different centuries, same result. The pattern isn't coincidence, it's protocol. Maybe the evidence was never lost. Maybe it was taken. Maybe we're not supposed to remember that paradise was built once before, without permission, by humans who proved we didn't need salvation because we were already capable of transcendence. What do you think happened to the evidence? Was it lost or was it taken? Drop your theory below. And if this has opened your eyes to what's been hidden, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the myths they buried are the memories that could change everything.